Great powers are told that stability serves everyone's interests and chaos threatens prosperity. What if I told you major powers deliberately engineer chaos because stable hierarchy prevents their rise? This sounds contradictory because we assume nations seek order and predictable international systems. But there's something that doesn't quite add up. Why do rising powers consistently destabilize regions right when cooperation would benefit everyone? The coordinated chaos strategy works by making the current order ungovernable without replacing it immediately. Multipolar powers create controlled instability that weakens existing hierarchies while building alternative structures. Think about the last major international crisis. Did it strengthen or weaken the dominant power's ability to maintain order? The system creates two completely different relationships with global stability depending on your position. For hegemonic powers, stability means preserving existing arrangements that guarantee their dominance. Every crisis threatens the hierarchy they built and benefit from maintaining. For rising powers, stability means permanent subordination. The current order wasn't designed for their benefit, so they gain nothing from preserving it. This explains something curious about how different powers respond to international institutions. Subscribe to Professor Jiang Explained if you want to see how global order serves different purposes for different nations. Share this with someone who believes international cooperation benefits all countries equally. Hegemonic powers defend international law when it protects their interests. Rising powers violate international law when it constrains their expansion. Same rules, completely opposite relationships. Consider how each group handles regional conflicts. The hegemonic power intervenes to restore order and preserve existing borders. They frame intervention as maintaining stability and preventing chaos. The rising power supports destabilizing forces that challenge existing arrangements. They frame this as supporting self-determination and opposing imperialism. One power wants frozen conflicts resolved through current frameworks. The other power wants frozen conflicts to remain unresolved and destabilizing. The destabilization preference creates what strategists might call the chaos asymmetry. Hegemonic powers lose more from disorder than rising powers do. When systems break down, the dominant power loses institutional advantages. Rising powers lose nothing because they never benefited from those institutions anyway. This asymmetry means chaos itself becomes a weapon that only works in one direction. But here's where the strategy becomes more sophisticated. Rising powers don't just create random chaos. They engineer specific instabilities that force hegemonic powers into impossible choices. Support one ally and alienate another. Intervene militarily and drain resources. Stay out and appear weak. Every option damages the hegemon's position regardless of which path they choose. Do you notice how every crisis seems to present only bad options for dominant powers? The option elimination isn't accidental. Rising powers study hegemonic systems to identify structural vulnerabilities. They then trigger crises at precisely those vulnerable points. The hegemon must respond, but every response accelerates their decline. The system also exploits what game theorists might call the maintenance cost differential. Maintaining global order requires enormous ongoing investment. The hegemon must keep military bases everywhere, provide security guarantees constantly, and intervene in conflicts perpetually. Rising powers pay none of these costs. They just need to create enough disorder that maintenance costs become unsustainable. Consider how different powers allocate resources. The hegemonic power spreads forces globally to maintain order everywhere simultaneously. They're defending hundreds of interests across dozens of regions. Rising powers concentrate forces regionally to challenge hegemony in specific areas. They only need to win locally while the hegemon must win everywhere to maintain credibility. The resource distribution creates permanent overextension for hegemonic powers. They cannot withdraw from commitments without appearing weak, but they cannot maintain commitments without exhausting themselves. Rising powers exploit this trap by forcing the hegemon to choose which commitments to abandon. Every abandoned commitment proves the system is collapsing. But there's something even more insidious about how chaos creation serves multipolar coordination. Rising powers don't need explicit agreements to cooperate in destabilizing hegemony. They just need to recognize that chaos helps everyone challenging the current order. This creates implicit coordination without formal alliances that might trigger hegemonic response. The implicit coordination works through what we might call convergent disruption. China destabilizes Asia. Russia destabilizes Europe. Regional powers destabilize their neighborhoods. Each action independently weakens hegemonic control. Together, they create system-wide chaos that no hegemon can manage simultaneously. The coordination happens through parallel interests rather than explicit planning. Have you ever wondered why multiple crises always seem to emerge simultaneously? The timing correlation isn't coincidental. Rising powers watch each other and time their moves for maximum hegemonic overload. When one power creates crisis, others launch their challenges. The hegemon cannot respond effectively to everything at once. Something always gets abandoned. The system maintains itself through what strategists call the escalation trap. When hegemonic powers respond forcefully to one crisis, rising powers interpret this as proof of declining capacity. If you were truly strong, you wouldn't need to respond so aggressively. The forceful response becomes evidence of weakness rather than strength. This invites more challenges rather than deterring them. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect involves how rising powers weaponize international norms. The hegemonic power built the current system on rules-based order. Rising powers now use those rules to constrain hegemonic action. You violated sovereignty here. You bypassed institutions there. Every hegemonic response to chaos gets framed as norm violation that justifies more resistance. The norm weaponization creates what international relations scholars might call the legitimacy paradox. The hegemon built global institutions to legitimize their dominance. Those same institutions now constrain their ability to respond to challenges. Rising powers operate outside institutional constraints while using institutions to restrict hegemonic responses. The system designed for control becomes a cage for its creator. There's also a temporal dimension where chaos serves long-term restructuring despite short-term costs. Hegemonic powers think in terms of immediate crisis management. They want to restore order quickly and return to normal. Rising powers think in terms of generational transformation. They accept prolonged instability as the price of fundamental reordering. Consider how different powers define success in crisis situations. The hegemonic power wants rapid resolution that preserves existing arrangements. Success means returning to the status quo before the crisis emerged. Rising powers want prolonged instability that prevents return to previous arrangements. Success means the old order cannot be restored regardless of how the specific crisis resolves. The definition gap means the same situation produces opposite evaluations. The hegemon sees unresolved crisis as failure requiring more intervention. Rising powers see unresolved crisis as success, proving the old order is dead. One side keeps trying to restore what the other side keeps trying to prevent from being restored. But there's another layer that makes coordinated chaos particularly effective. Hegemonic populations expect order and become demoralized by persistent chaos. Rising power populations expect struggle and interpret chaos as proof of fighting imperialism. This psychological asymmetry means domestic support erodes differently. The hegemon's population demands withdrawal. Rising power populations demand persistence. The morale differential creates strategic endurance advantages for rising powers. They can sustain chaos longer than hegemons can sustain order maintenance. Eventually, hegemonic populations force their leaders to abandon commitments. Rising powers achieve through exhaustion what they couldn't achieve through direct confrontation. The chaos doesn't need to defeat the hegemon militarily. It just needs to last long enough that maintaining order becomes domestically unsustainable. This creates what military strategists call the fatigue asymmetry in great power competition. The hegemon exhausts itself responding to infinite provocations. Rising powers rotate, which actor creates the next crisis. China challenges in one region while Russia challenges in another. Neither faces sustained pressure. The hegemon faces constant pressure everywhere. Fatigue accumulates asymmetrically until something breaks. The rotation strategy also prevents the hegemon from developing effective counter-strategies. Each crisis appears unique, requiring customized responses. The hegemon never recognizes the underlying pattern because crises manifest differently. Currency manipulation here, territorial expansion there, cyber operations elsewhere. The tactics vary, but the strategy remains constant. Create ungovernable chaos that exceeds hegemonic management capacity. There's also an economic dimension where chaos disrupts the hegemonic advantage in global finance. Stable international systems allow hegemonic currencies to dominate trade and investment. Chaos creates demand for alternative currencies and payment systems. Each crisis that freezes assets or imposes sanctions pushes more nations toward de-dollarization. The financial architecture that sustained hegemony gets dismantled through repeated instability that makes reliance on hegemonic systems appear risky. Can you think of any declining hegemon that successfully managed multiple simultaneous challenges? The historical pattern reveals the strategy's effectiveness. Every previous hegemon faced coordinated chaos from rising powers. Spain dealt with Dutch revolt plus English piracy plus Ottoman expansion. Britain faced German industrialization plus American growth plus colonial independence movements. The timing is never coincidental. Rising powers coordinate through recognizing shared interest in destabilization. The chaos strategy also systematically erodes hegemonic alliance structures. Allies join hegemons for security guarantees and economic benefits. Persistent chaos demonstrates that security guarantees are unreliable. The hegemon cannot protect everyone simultaneously. Each abandoned ally proves the system is failing. Other allies notice and begin hedging. They open channels with rising powers while maintaining hegemonic relationships. This hedging behavior further weakens hegemonic position. The alliance erosion accelerates as chaos persists because fence-sitting becomes the rational strategy. Why commit fully to a hegemon that might abandon you? Better to maintain options with both sides. This creates what strategists call alliance hollowing. The formal structures remain, but commitment disappears. Treaties exist, but aren't credible. The hegemon discovers during actual crisis that allies won't fulfill obligations. The alliance system becomes performative rather than functional. Do you notice how hegemonic allies increasingly ignore their supposed leaders' demands? The defiance isn't random rebellion. It reflects calculated assessment that hegemonic power to enforce compliance has weakened. Chaos has made the costs of defiance manageable. The hegemon might express displeasure, but cannot actually punish allies without pushing them toward rising powers. The alliance becomes a trap where the hegemon must tolerate disobedience or accelerate their own isolation. The system perpetuates itself because hegemonic powers that successfully manage one crisis get celebrated as proof that order can be maintained. Those that fail get blamed for poor strategy rather than recognizing structural impossibility. Meanwhile, rising powers that create chaos get portrayed as revisionist troublemakers when they're actually following rational grand strategy for displacing dominant powers. And perhaps most remarkably, the system has convinced observers that chaos is a problem to be solved rather than a strategy being executed. When understanding that coordinated chaos isn't a bug in the international system, but rather the fundamental mechanism through which power transitions occur and new orders emerge from the deliberate destruction of old hierarchies.